Welcome to the SRA podcast. I'm Faye.
And I'm Austin.
Today we have an interview with Robert Evans, former Crack editor and host of the Behind the Bastards and It Could Happen Here podcasts. But first, we need to talk about some of the things that have been happening recently in this country. So just the other day, we discussed this in the interview later, but some more information has come out. A video surfaced showing a group of armed militia members on the U.S.-Mexican border in New Mexico taking custody of a group of Central American migrants entering the U.S. seeking asylum. Just armed right-wing militiamen with AR-15s rounding up scared women and children, literal refugees, asylum seekers who came to this country looking for support. Essentially, this armed gang rounded them up, kidnapped them, and delivered them to Customs and Border Patrol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really dark time. It feels a little historically familiar if anyone looks at the kind of things that the Nazis were doing in Germany around this time. We're quite a ways into those historical parallels.
Especially considering that the militia claims that they were doing this with explicit support from Customs and Border Patrol. However, this may not be quite as bleak as it seems, because after the media broke this story, several days after the video first surfaced, of course, this became a thing on the mainstream media. The FBI did in fact arrest the leader of the group, a man named Larry Hopkins, who has apparently been active in the New Mexico militia scene for quite some time. He has previous weapons charges, including felony charges, so his ownership of a firearm now is illegal. And the FBI did arrest him on illegal possession of a gun. It's believed that they may eventually target other members of this gang. So the federal government has responded to this vigilante, right-wing, pseudo-fascist formation, but only after it became a deal on social media and the news.
Yeah, it's nice that at least some of American law enforcement is centrist enough that they're not explicitly okay with citizens rounding up migrants at gunpoint. I certainly wouldn't expect any local PDs to take that stand and go after psychopaths like this, but at least the FBI can be kind of persuaded, like, all right, we'll stop infiltrating socialist organizations for a sec and take care of the actual hotbed of terrorists who regularly commit violence in this country.
Well, the thing is, the FBI knew about this guy and knew about his militia ever since he was reported in 2017. They received a tip-off that this guy might be involved in militia shit. They sent an agent to his house, went in there, discovered that he had 10 firearms and was a felon, and then they left. No charges were filed. There's apparently no follow-up. They just let him go. Oh, he seems like a nice guy. And he says the guns belong to his common-law wife, so I guess that's legit.
Oh, yeah, you can't do anything about that. I mean, that's airtight.
So, I think one thing that a lot of people on the left do is they take the maxim, all cops are bastards, yes, and take that to mean that all cops are the same. But that's not the case. Different law enforcement agencies in different locations with different amounts of power have different political leanings and different degrees of psychopathy. So Customs and Border Patrol has very different material interests from the FBI. The FBI fundamentally is an organization which exists to enforce the federal government's status quo. The FBI is there to make sure that federal law is upheld and maintains its force within society. They are the Federal Bureau of Investigations, as opposed to the local cops, who may be much more deeply tied to local city politics, as is the case in, say, Seattle and Portland, where local cops are deeply intertwined with local right-wing militias, where there's a great deal of commingling of interest between the right-wingers who want to kill and otherwise fuck up left-wing protesters and activists, and the police who want to get rid of these annoying left-wing protesters and activists.
Yeah. And let's not forget them turning a blind eye to violence against trans people. People just riding around in trucks, ganking random people. That's apparently fine too.
Absolutely. I mean, we could talk about Seattle and Portland all day, but, and then in situations where you have an agency like Customs and Border Patrol, where their mission is to enforce the border and prevent illegal crossings and to account for immigrants and take them into custody. That's their goal, that's their material interest. And if this militia was willing to help them in this way by rounding people up, then I have no doubt that Customs and Border Patrol was extremely grateful for their assistance, because they don't necessarily care about federal law outside of the context of guarding the border.
Yeah, this is something that you kind of see over and over again. This happened in Britain in, I believe, like the 80s or so, where the skinhead movement kind of became infiltrated by white nationalists, and National Front is what they're called there. And multiple politicians have been interviewed about this, that they were more than happy to just let the racist skinheads do whatever the fuck they wanted to do. They were fine with them committing violence against leftist activists, committing violence against trans people or people from the queer community in general. They knew how they were going to vote. They knew that a fearful populace is one that tends to vote conservative, and they were more than happy to just let them do whatever they wanted to do because it was politically advantageous for them. So, this is something that we see kind of over and over again, that those in political office on the right will pretty happily just endorse whatever militias are doing on the border and stuff like that. So you're definitely not going to see any kind of action or response from people on the right. It's the best that you're going to get is a fundamentally centrist organization kind of begrudgingly, after a lot of public pressure, arresting one guy who's like, oh, I guess he's a felon, he's got more guns than he probably should, and he's pointing them at women and children. All right, fine, maybe we won't sneak into his house at night and execute him like we did to Fred Hampton. We'll figure out a different way to do it.
Yeah, it's sort of telling the difference in approach. The police will act against right-wingers, but they'll only do it grudgingly, and they'll do so with the lightest touch, with the softest gloves that they possibly can. I mean, this guy was peacefully arrested. He wasn't, dragged out of his car at gunpoint. He wasn't, like you said, they didn't come into his house and murder this guy. You compare that to the way that people on the left have been dealt with by both federal and local law enforcement. Brett with Rev Left Radio recently did an interview with an activist regarding the MOVE bombing in 1985. It's a long story, but basically an activist group opposing the Philadelphia police over a series of years led to police harassment and violence against this majority black group, the MOVE group. The police essentially escalated that to the point where they actually surrounded the MOVE house and fired 10,000 rounds into it, with 50 caliber and 30 caliber machine guns, with sniper rifles, with all sorts of heavy ordnance, and eventually dropped a 20-pound C4 bomb on top of the building, lighting it on fire and killing almost the entire group, including 5 children. Compare that to how the feds dealt with, say, the occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, where a group of armed right-wing militia nuts occupied a federal building in the wilderness and claimed it as their own territory. And, the feds are just happy to sit back, wait it out, let them get bored and trickle out one by one and surrender to custody. And then, they came in and dealt with the last 4 diehard nut jobs and shot one of them after he pulled a pistol. Yeah, just look at the completely different levels of force used to deal with the left versus the right. We're at the point where militias are openly working with select law enforcement agencies, where local right-wing politicians are working with militias and with the police against left-wing activists. We're not quite to a sort of fascist brown shirt situation, but I think it's a lot closer than a lot of people would think. And of course, this sort of violence extends beyond merely right-wing militias, because of course we can't forget security industrial complex as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important to remember that when it comes down to it, the left is against the status quo and the right is for the violent enforcement of the status quo, especially when it comes to racial socioeconomic disparities, and they're very pro that. And so it becomes pretty clear once we get to these crashes that capitalism inevitably causes, once we get to these crisis moments where, it's either socialism or barbarism and stuff like that, it's pretty clear where law enforcement tends to go. Law enforcement tends to protect property, and they tend to lean right because of that.
During the Spanish Civil War, the various Spanish police forces in the various cities in Spain were willing to work with Franco's fascists. They were willing to work with the liberals. They were even willing, in some limited circumstances, to work with the Soviet communists. However, at no point were the police willing to work side by side with the anarchists in Spain, and always opposed them and always killed and murdered them at every opportunity.
Yeah. It is kind of interesting to see a lot of ghosts from the past, some of the people who have enforced fascism, who have crushed anyone pushing for labor rights and stuff like that. It's interesting to see how some of those old ghosts poke up their heads again. Like, for example, the New York Times recently published an article about the Pinkertons. They're still around. And not only are they still around, but they're based in Mexico City, at least partially. And they're gearing up for what they call climate chaos, which is what they're pretty accurately predicting will be floods of people trying desperately to survive against the small amount of people who own just about all of the resources on the planet. And the Pinkertons are trying to figure out how they can market themselves so that they can protect those people and gun down the unwashed masses.
Yes, and it's worth taking a moment to point out that a lot of people seem to think that the right in this country doesn't believe in climate change. That's not true. Evangelicals don't believe in climate change because they're idiots. But the right as a whole does believe in climate change. They might not believe that it's driven by human activity, but I believe recent polls have shown that around 70% of the US population believes that climate change is happening, and that includes more than half of Republicans. So it's worth keeping in mind that especially in the more institutional sectors of the conservative establishment, especially when it comes to the higher levels of the firearms industry, the security industry, corporate boards of all kinds, these are people who are taking climate change seriously and planning for the effects of it. And the effects of climate change are absolutely going to be bad for corporations' bottom lines and for the personal safety of many corporate officers. So the Pinkertons, of course, are more than happy to provide any sort of security services these groups might need. Now, it's worth keeping in mind, you think of security, you think of a few guys with guns standing around, maybe that, usually with pistols, maybe they have a rifle, it's just a security guard. That's not what the Pinkertons are doing. The Pinkertons are essentially gearing up to act as a corporate army, or at the very least a corporate police force, armed with modern firearms, modern tactical gear, helicopters, with rapid transit and deployment systems all over the globe to move highly trained operators, essentially, into areas where they can provide support to corporate entities to protect their property, to protect their profits, to protect their people. We could be seeing situations where in 30 years, if there's a shortage of water in India, maybe a mass movement of people goes and tries to shut down the Nestle plant that's draining their aquifers, to shut down that pumping plant and, take that water back for the people. We could see that being guarded by essentially corporate thugs with machine guns, with air support, with grenades and rocket launchers, willing not just to use crowd suppression tactics, but actual lethal force to protect private property in the interest of preserving the profits of multinational corporations.
They pretty fittingly favor the Israeli Galil, just in case anyone's curious. They're like, oh, well, this is used to gun down a lot of innocent people. Like, why aren't we using that?
Never doubt the judgment of a right-wing psychopath in their choice of small arms, because they're going to look for the most efficient tool to kill brown people that they possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. No, they pay attention. They pay attention to the numbers that the Galil does. But it is interesting to see the lengths that they're going to attempt to predict climate disasters that are coming. I believe in that article they mentioned that it's been getting a little difficult lately because there are so many disasters happening lately. There's like one disastrous hurricane or some other kind of climate disaster per year. It's getting a little bit harder to convince the wealthy that they should just always have at least a few Pinkertons on hand to dispatch against, people who are monstrous enough to want to drink water or want to eat food or would like to not be in flooded areas with, downed power lines and stuff like that.
People who might want to burn down giant oil palm plantations in order to actually grow edible food that can be eaten without mixing it with ingredients that they don't have. Keep that in mind every time you open up a new jar of Nutella. So the actual quote from the article here is, "Whatever the exact costs of climate change, it is Pinkerton's job to read between the numbers looking for the potential for violence. If you're suffering only one hurricane every 20 years or so, shelling out $1 million to Pinkerton isn't such a big deal," Paz explained. "You bake it into your risk. But if there's a disaster every year, which is happening more and more, it makes sense to have dedicated staff on standby. A Pinkerton on standby doesn't mean protection for just your insurable risks, but also for the uninsurable risks, business interruptions, theft of trade secrets, pandemics. And with the environment increasingly weaponized against the poor, to borrow Wallace Wells' phrase, the sectors that rely on cheap labor will face more unrest among workers. The state will struggle to keep up with crime, and in the aftermath of storms with landslides blocking first responders, regional offices will be cut off." So they're straight up acknowledging here that workers are going to seek to organize against the exploitative labor practices that multinational corporations use against them.
Yeah, I think it's becoming pretty interesting to see just how badly liberalism and centrism will fail in addressing a lot of these problems because they've never really had to deal with, humans in general haven't really had to deal with disasters of this magnitude, at least in an extremely long time. As far as what our government is currently capable of handling, it's absolutely out of its depth when it comes to handling climate disaster, mass immigration, when it comes to addressing the needs of humanity in general and not just the needs of their interests. You're really kind of seeing the gaps, and the right and left are both extremely critical of the current establishment. The right's solutions are absolutely monstrous and are never up for debate and should never be discussed on anyone's platform ever. But they also recognize the gaps in the system. They see that finding a kind of gradual solution and being like, I don't know if Medicare for all is the way that we should go right now, or, I think that we should meet with corporate heads and try to find some kind of compromise on the amount of emissions that they're allowed. And I think that all of that wishy-washy centrist bullshit is absolutely inept in the face of disasters that are coming. And you have people like Pinkerton preparing for it. You have the people who hire Pinkerton that are preparing for it. They're seeing that people are coming after convoys. They're seeing that people really would rather not die for no reason just because other people are wealthy. And you have organizations like ours who are actually dedicated to protecting communities, that are dedicated to making sure that people get fed when disasters happen, that they have a roof over their heads and that they have water. And Pinkerton being Pinkerton for quite a while now, I believe ever since the 80s or so, I believe they have a practice where a Pinkerton agent will kind of seem like a new hire, will just kind of socialize with the other workers, basically just be your standard employee, but then they report to their bosses any kind of labor organization that's happening, any kind of agitation that's going on and stuff like that.
That dates back to the 1880s. That was basically their original job.
Right, yeah.
The Pinkertons were hugely influential during the 20s and 30s and the 40s as infiltrators, provocateurs, strikebreakers. And that's another thing to note, that the Pinkertons back then and today aren't just engaged in the act of physical security, of committing violence to protect property. They're also engaged in surveillance and data collection. One of the more frightening things talked about in this article is that the Pinkertons are seeking to have data-driven corporate security, where they're collecting information from companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and using that information to try to algorithmically predict not only when disasters occur, but what sort of impact that this will have on companies' operations. The Pinkertons are going to be working with companies like Palantir, which act essentially as data collection and interpretation centers for nation states and armies. And I can guarantee that all the data that you put out into the internet, unknowingly, unwillingly, that's collected by these massive social media and internet companies, that data is going to be boiled down, interpreted, and fed into an algorithm that will be used to oppress you, not only politically and economically, but through violence as well, if necessary. You don't need the NSA to spy on people. The corporations are getting pretty good at doing that themselves. So this is all pretty dire. So what do we actually do about it? Well, you could turn to the electoral process and hope to maybe we can put someone in office who can reverse these trends, can ban companies like the Pinkertons, can ban this unjust data collection, that can crack down on the cooperation between law enforcement and the militia, right? But I'm not sure that that's really going to work. Even with people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, people who are really the left wing of what's possible to exist in electoral politics at the moment, I haven't heard any talk from either of those campaigns about how they might respond to right-wing militias. How will they deal with the possibility that if they become elected and they take office, their governance might be undermined by active collaboration between cops and Klan? I'm not sure that that's really something that's been addressed at any point. There's still the hope, I suppose, that we can try to stop this runaway train of imminent disaster, but I think this is why Bernie Sanders is important. I'm not an electoralist. I don't believe that socialism will ever be achieved by electoral politics, not in the long run. However, I think that Bernie Sanders is an extremely important candidate and an extremely important figure on the left, because he was willing to go into the lion's den on Fox News and face hostile interviewers and a potentially hostile audience to try to reach out to these people on the right who watch Fox News and try to reach them with a different message.
And I think the really important thing that kind of happened with Bernie's town hall is that the working class on the right has been manipulated. They've been manipulated by powerful, wealthy, evil people who want them to believe that they're truly voting for their interests when they vote for a right-wing candidate. And I think it's important to pay attention to what happens when someone like Bernie talks on Fox News. He's putting the message of socialism. He's putting the philosophy. He's not engaging in the jingoism that the right often engages in to just shut down any kind of thought process about it. They've been calling anything left of National Socialism communism for a very long time now. And I think it's important to pay attention to just how reachable workers on the right actually are. Keep in mind that because they've been manipulated with such empty platitudes, with such empty jingoism, it's important to keep in mind that they don't actually know what socialism looks like. They don't know what it actually means to have some amount of democratic say in your workplace, to have actual democratic say in your existence in a country. They have no idea what those things look like. And so it's important to keep in mind that there's a big difference between viewers of Fox News and the people who join fascist militias. Those people are absolutely reachable, but you can't play their game of jingoism and arguing over fucking definitions on goddamn Twitter. You have to find a way to put the thoughts of socialism and to put the philosophy of people having inherent value, of not needing to prove their right to live to society through their labor, but them having just inherent value. You have to put those thoughts in people's heads. you have to put those things into practice, because as long as the right can just scare its constituents into seeing like, yeah, but they're a socialist and socialism is bad. You remember learning about that? You remember learning about how socialism is bad? As long as they're using those empty arguments, they are absolutely ripe for the picking for actual socialist outreach. Any amount of salvation that's going to come from things like this is undoubtedly helped by people like Bernie, who put the words in people's mouths, who get the concepts in their heads, but do not look to electoralism to save you when push comes to shove. This is going to be something that we're going to have to band together as communities to actually insulate each other from.
And that's why I recommend listening to shows like the It Could Happen Here podcast. So we're going to have a quick intermission, and then we're going to come back with an interview with Robert Evans, the host of It Could Happen Here. This is a podcast which focuses on the possibility of a second American Civil War and what that future might look like and what we can do to avoid it. So stick around after the break. All right, welcome back, folks. Today we have an interview with Robert Evans of the It Could Happen Here podcast. He's a journalist formerly with Cracked, who's been all over doing reporting on various conflicts around the world. And today he's here to talk to us about the possibility of civil war in America and the role that the left might play in it. How you doing, Robert?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me on.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your podcasting?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of wound up accidentally in journalism. I started out as a comedy writer and wound up interviewing people, not realizing it would lead to doing any actual journalism, just thinking it would lead to more interesting articles. And then like a year or so later, I was in Ukraine reporting from that civil war. And then about a year after that, I was in Iraq and did that for the next couple of years. And it just sort of snowballed. And I kind of came to the conclusion while I was over in Iraq, because my first trip to Iraq was in 2016. So I was in Iraq, and then I went to the RNC and the DNC prior to the election that year. And I was shocked by how similar a lot of the emotions and a lot of even some of the words used by people in both places was, and came to the realization that what I had seen in Iraq was essentially the political process when faith in the political process gets low enough that enough people pick up firearms. And it became very clear to me through the rest of the year that process was getting closer and closer in the United States, that like faith in sort of the political process had eroded to such an extent and was continuing to erode to such an extent that I actually thought armed conflict between different political groups was getting increasingly likely. You know, I started podcasting. I did some podcasting in my old job at Cracked, and then when we all got laid off in the digital media crash, my old boss, Jack O'Brien, had started working with Stuff Media, and so I pitched them a podcast on dictators and stuff, and they bought it, and it was successful, so I pitched them another podcast on my paranoid ravings about an American Civil War, and that became It Could Happen Here, and so that's more or less the story.
Nice. So one thing I did while looking up like previous podcasts that you've done, I found that you actually recorded a podcast on the subject of Civil War at Cracked in 2016 on the eve of the 2016 election. And I was sort of struck by the similarity of what you said then to what you say in It Could Happen Here, and how many of the trends that you were worried about have continued up to this point.
Yeah, I don't like being right about this stuff, but I have been, and it's Not great. That's part of why I made the podcast. Is I was talking with Jack, my boss, who I did that episode of the podcast to crack, because I wrote an article, and it actually ran like literally 2 or 3 days before the election about the possibility of a second American Civil War, and it was very successful. And a lot of people reached out to me saying I was a loon. And then about a year and a half or so later, the New Yorker and the New York Times and a bunch of other sort of more mainstream publications started writing about the same possibility. And that was part of what kind of, when Jack and I started talking, prompted me to do a whole podcast series about it, was the fact that everything that I'd been worried about in 2016 had just accelerated. All those trends that you mentioned had accelerated, and it just seemed even more likely.
Right. So one of the things that I really like about your podcast is that you approach these sorts of possibilities of a civil war and the sort of conflicts that might occur in a much more, I think, realistic fashion than a lot of people usually think about it. Because a lot of people, when they think about civil war, they do have that idea of like the American Civil War, where you have states secede and then they have, two competing nations, and, you have armies in the field with military conflicts. People think about that and they think that that's ridiculous. It's impossible. It's never going to happen. And that's correct, because that specifically is never going to happen. But the sort of things that you've talked about are based much more in your experiences in places like Iraq, like Ukraine, the sorts of things that are going on in Syria and Libya, which are sort of the modern incarnation of a civil war. And I think that a lot of people don't necessarily understand how those conflicts work and how at least feasible it is for something like that to occur in the US or almost any other country.
No, because we like to think, for one thing, about our political differences being fundamentally different from the political differences that occur in those parts of the world. And I think in a lot of cases this comes down to Orientalism or just plain racism. But there's this attitude that like what they deal with is fundamentally different than what we deal with. But I mean, the reality of the situation is you look at like the Kurdish Peshmerga, who are one of the big forces fighting ISIS. All of the Peshmerga are members of one or two political parties, which are both the equivalents of, one is the equivalent of, the Republican Party, and one is the equivalent of the Democratic Party. One's kind of center left and one's kind of center right. But that's what like their military is like each of their big political parties has an armed wing, and they fought occasionally and they fight together when like there's a threat to their overall sovereignty. And ISIS is really a political party. They're not, when you talk about ISIS attacks in Europe or in the United States, they're more of a traditional terrorist group. But when you think about what ISIS was in Iraq in particular, because ISIS in Iraq and ISIS in Syria, while they had connections, were very different in a lot of ways. But ISIS in Iraq was essentially an armed Sunni political party that was very angry at what the Iraqi police and what the Iraqi government had done to Sunnis in the city of Mosul. And you can almost draw some lines between them and some movements we have in the United States, because like a lot of what the initial ISIS supporters in Mosul, and most of these people stopped backing ISIS well before Mosul fell, because they realized that ISIS was kind of full of shit too. But a lot of these people were like, look, we're being murdered by the cops out here for being Sunni. And like, I don't agree with everything ISIS says, but I don't want to keep losing family members to like midnight raids by the police where they'll just like execute and dump them in a ditch. And I talked to a lot of these people, and there was the people who initially supported ISIS, there was a huge fuck the police tinge to like why they thought ISIS might be worth backing for a while. And it just goes to show that like when you're in a place where there's no faith whatsoever in the political process to protect people or further any of the things that are important to them, they'll back whoever has a gun and says, we'll deal with this problem for you.
And it's sort of concerning seeing how much people in the US on both the left and the right have lost faith in the political process here, whether that be people on the right who are afraid of, George Soros' deep state conspiracies and liberals coming to take their guns, or people on the left who are worried about Trump being a Russian stooge or the potential rise of fascism through the electoral process.
Yeah, I mean, it's you see it on both sides, and it's the result of scared people. Like most political violence isn't the result of bad actors with fundamentally evil motives. Those people do exist, and they're valuable in raising the temperature and making violence more likely. But the vast majority of people are scared and feel threatened. It's part of this thing that worries me, because there's major facets in which I'm supportive of an armed left. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that one thing that often leads to civil violence is you have two opposed groups increasingly arming because they see the other group arming, and it worries them. So, like, that's one of those things that's very concerning to me, because we're in a situation right now where the far right has more guns than anyone else in this country. And so if it comes to civil conflict, that's not great. At the same time, there's things that very much do worry me about everybody just getting more weapons. And it's one of those things that does make you think back to, like, mutually assured destruction, during the Cold War, where it's like, yeah, it's terrible that you've got 12,000 nuclear missiles and these sort of like systems that allow both sides to fire their arsenals, even when most of the people on those sides are dead already. But at the same time, you can make a cogent argument that it's why we didn't use those weapons. And so it's like, I kind of feel the same about having huge groups of armed people politically opposed to each other in the country, where it's possible that it will end in cataclysmic violence. It's also possible that if the right is confronted like they were in Stone Mountain with large groups of armed leftists, that it will make violence less likely, because most of those people don't want to have a gunfight. They want to be the ones with guns protecting themselves in their eyes, or forcing their will on people without guns. But if they realize that it will be a fight's less likely to happen. I don't know which of those is more likely. I can see both of them being very plausible. And so it's a really concerning situation for that reason.
Exactly. And as a socialist, I sort of feel like the left is in a situation where we're not really in control of the levers of power. So anything that we do is ultimately a reaction to what larger forces in society are doing. So what we're doing with the SRA, I think, is we're really trying to channel people's fear and people's desire to arm themselves, and really trying to turn that towards a productive use, towards a defensive posture, and towards also putting energy into things like community building, community defense, disaster relief. We don't necessarily want to build a militia. If someone wants to do that, that's their prerogative. But with the SRA, it's sort of the idea that we want to protect ourselves and protect each other without necessarily escalating the situation or raising the temperature. So I think that's a really sort of attack that a lot of people on the left should be taking towards this, because I don't think that arming up and planning for a civil war or a revolution is ever going to really go well for the left in this country.
Yeah, I mean, part of it's that there's such a gap right now to be made up in terms of, like, who has the weapons. But part of it is just that, like, you look at the who the police and who the military are going to back, and I think more of them are likely to back a far-right insurgency than they would a far-left insurgencies.
You can see this actually occurring now with the Portland police, who were revealed to be coordinating with members of Patriot Prayer. And just this week, the story of a armed militia on the border essentially kidnapping asylum seekers trying to cross the border, apprehending these people with AR-15s, and then taking them to Customs and Border Patrol. That's something that I think is incredibly disturbing, not just that there is this armed militia, but that it is working with the state, and the state is willing to allow these people to act extrajudicially in the interest of promoting their own goals, which I think sort of speaks to the sort of political situation we're in right now.
Yeah, it's that's one of the most worrying things I've seen. Jason Wilson with The Guardian also just published an article today or yesterday talking about a guy named Shea, who's like a local Republican official in Washington, and like some internal communications he and some of his colleagues had back when they thought, it was, I think it was last year, when people were talking about this, the Antifa is going to do a revolution or whatever, and they were worried about that, like talking about rounding up leftists and like shaving them with K-bars and like going after like known political activists and killing them. Like that sort of violence is just barely held in check right now. And the last thing in the world I want to see is anyone put mainstream law enforcement, particularly beyond like border patrol, to the test as to whether or not they back that sort of violence in a situation of mass unrest. It's really like a tiger by the tail kind of situation right now, where I support resistance against fascist groups, against neo-Nazis, against these far-right gangs, but the left has to be extraordinarily careful, because these guys can get away with shooting into a crowd and it doesn't damage their larger cause. And if a leftist throws a bottle, it does a lot of damage to the cause. And that's fundamentally unfair, but it's also just the reality on the ground that has to be acknowledged.
Exactly, and there will never be a parity in the treatment of left-wing protesters versus right-wing protesters, and anyone who expects fairness out of that situation, I think, is naive. So we sort of have to take the situation where, yeah, we can have these street movements of Antifa to shut down these sorts of right-wing rallies and recruitment opportunities and things like that, but at the same time, like you're saying, that's not something that we really want to escalate, because when the left escalates, the police are much, much more willing and ready to inflict massive violence on left-wing protesters or left-wing groups. You know, the way that Black Panthers were dismantled, rather, Fred Hampton's assassination, things like the MOVE bombings, where police used literal 50 caliber machine guns and M60s and a 20 pound of C4 bomb on a almost lightly armed group. They had a shotgun and some 22s, lightly armed group in a barricaded house, because they had made enemies with the police and had become a thorn in the police's side, and the police were willing to use violence against this left-wing group because the left is seen as un-American and is thus easier for these groups to essentially dehumanize or to delegitimize them as legitimate citizens of the country, and therefore they're better able to inflict violence. So that's a dynamic that people need to be aware of.
Yeah, and it's frustrating because people talk about, like, well, should we punch Nazis and stuff, and like get into the morality of that? And it's like, I'm not arguing the morality of it with you. Like, ethically, I have no issue with a Nazi getting hit in the face. The question is, does it help overall to be seen doing that? Because if the Nazi's not wearing a swastika, which most of them don't anymore, then, you know, the ethics of hitting that Nazi matter less than whether or not hitting that Nazi brings more violence down on left-wing organizing and does damage to the overall ability of the left to oppose these people, which is why I tend to be much more supportive of the kind of digital actions undertaken by anti-fascists, which isn't to say that there's not value in, because we saw in like New York what happens when there's not sufficient numbers of people to physically present kind of a barrier to these, you know, far-right groups when they organize. You know, they assault people in the streets. But it's a very dangerous situation. And all it takes is a couple of bad actors who, you know, are dressed the same as everybody else on the left, you know, in black bloc or whatever, to cause a lot of damage to the overall movement. And it's the same reason, like, I'm very supportive of Rose City Antifa, because in my experience covering them, they're very disciplined. They stick in a large group. They are very coordinated, and I don't see them starting shit. Whereas I've seen other individual, unaffiliated anti-fascists start shit in situations where I don't think that was productive, and I think it made the left-wing groups on the whole look bad. But it's also impossible to tell who those individuals were with because everybody's just dressed in black. You know, RCA, it's easier to tell who they are because they tend to have, you know, banners and stuff, and they're all kind of coordinated around an area. But yeah, it's a really difficult situation, and it's not a fair one, but that, you know, we're not dealing in a fair world.
Exactly. And yeah, you can never tell if someone who commits violence at one of these anti-fascist actions, if this person is, you know, just some teenage adventurist who just wants to break shit, or if it's an actual agent provocateur, which the police have also used. For instance, in Toronto protests against the G20, they had cops throwing bricks and bottles to justify police violence against left-wing protesters. So that's sort of like the main concern with this protest movement left and this anti-fascist street movement left, is that it might be necessary or justifiable to stage these actions against fascist organizing to disrupt them, but at the same time, that can't be the whole movement, because if that is what you're doing, you're not really building left-wing power or consciousness, you're just basically spending the left's overall social capital, the left's reputation in these acts of violence to disrupt the ability of the right to organize. And so if you spend all of the left's goodwill and image as being a group that's for the people and for justice, and you do that, and you waste all that, and, you know, you have that bad optics of punching someone who is a Nazi but doesn't look like it, that makes it a lot easier for the police to justify violence. I think we'd agree that it's maybe not always unjustified to do those actions, but it's the sort of thing where we should be cautious about it and not make that the core of the entire movement. I think it's much more productive to put efforts into building left-wing institutions and parties And I think it's possible to do that while also having an armed wing and doing it in a responsible, defensive, community defense sort of mindset where you don't have people out in the streets in tactical gear escalating things with the Nazis and taking a defensive and reactionary posture. So in my opinion, if the left does want to arm, that's the way that it should be done. So that's the way that we're trying to do it. But what are your sort of thoughts on the armed left in general? Do you think that having an armed left is helpful, or do you think that it's maybe outweighed by the consequences of escalation?
I'll tell you one thing that is very clear to me in my work reporting from war zones is that people who do not have weapons in those areas have no agency. And so I will say for my own self, as somebody who is worried about this possibility, I am not going to disarm. I am very careful as to whether or not and for whom I advocate arming. I do not advocate that people who have a serious history of suicidal ideation arm themselves, because I think the risks at this point outweigh the potential protective benefit of being armed, because having access to a firearm is a major contributing factor to the likelihood that someone will commit suicide. And that is undeniable.
Absolutely.
One thing I suggest to people who do have a history of suicidal ideation but may be interested in being armed is to train with a group like the SRA, use other people's firearms, and even potentially purchase like a lower receiver, or find someone else who doesn't want to have a gun in the house, and each have a couple pieces of a couple of AR-15s, so that neither of you can assemble the full gun, but if you come together, could assemble full functional firearms in an emergency situation. That way you do not have a firearm in your home. You could not build a firearm with the pieces you have, but if you get together with a comrade, the two of you could put together a couple of AR-15s in a reasonably short period of time. That's a reasonable idea. It minimizes risk. I do think the primary organizing purpose of the left in this period of time should not be to arm up, but it is an important thing to do, and communities should be looking at ways to defend themselves, and people who feel as if they confidently can, without additional danger, own a firearm and train with one. That is a good idea. One thing I always do say is that there's no downside in preparing a stockpile of dried food, of water purification tablets, of a couple of filtration devices. Zero downside to that. It's useful in a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake, and it's useful if the shooting starts. So everyone should be doing that, whether or not they get a firearm. I am generally supportive of gun ownership for a variety of reasons. It's one of those things where I think, the NRA, I think, has done a lot of damage to the future viability of being armed in this country. But I think that this is an area where a lot of people on the right are more often correct than particularly a lot of liberals, which is that it's a fundamental human right to be able to defend yourself, and it's a bad idea for the government to have a monopoly on the use of violent force. And so I am generally supportive of people across the political spectrum having access to firearms and that sort of training and being ready to take their own self-defense into their own hands.
Absolutely. It's the sort of thing where I always have to wonder about the liberals who say, you want to disarm the populace, ban all guns, but at the same time they're saying that Trump is a fascist Russian stooge who's going to take over and implement martial law, and he's like a Nazi or whatever. It's like, what are you thinking there? You want to take away your only means of defense when you're worried about a fascist takeover? There must be some sort of cognitive dissonance there, because I don't understand it.
Yeah, I'm not gonna claim to understand it either. I think it's a evidence of something that's not entirely bad, which is that a lot of people, and since most of the country, the largest single group in this country, are moderate liberals, they tend to have overall faith in our institutions. Even though they can be critical of the police and critical of the military, they have faith that those institutions will more often than not protect them and people like them that they live around. And it's not terrible that they think that, because one of the things that keeps us from crossing over into the howling madness of civil conflict is that a large enough chunk of the country trusts that their institutions will protect them. And so because they feel that way, they don't understand why anyone would need to own military-style firearms in particular. And if you have trust in the military, if you have trust in the police, you may feel they're the only ones who should have access to those firearms. And I think one reason why both the far right and the far left tend to be more open to the idea of being armed is that neither of those groups have much trust in the state organs of power to protect them. It's actually kind of a little bit of common ground between those two groups, which is that they both feel that you fundamentally can't trust the government. And if you do trust the government, then why would you want every Tom, Dick, and Harry to have an AR-15?
Right. So one thing that the SRA has tried to do is that we have tried to reach out and sort of, maybe try to start building relationships with people on the right who are pro-gun as well. I believe on your most recent episode of the It Could Happen Here podcast, you talked about the need for us to try to build those relationships, to try to have those conversations when we can. Obviously, always keep safety in mind, particularly if you're a member of a marginalized group. But an important way to avoid these sorts of conflicts is to reach out and talk to people who have differing opinions. So the SRA has at various times tried to reach out to right-wing groups or platforms to try to build that dialogue, but the response we've often had has been one of two things. Either people refuse to believe that the SRA is actually pro-gun ownership. I've been accused of being a Soros shill and that I'm lying about supporting guns to somehow take their guns away. It doesn't make much sense. But then also another response that we've had from many people in the gun community, especially maybe more radicalized parts of it, like AR15.com, we typically get a response along the lines of, "Bring it on, commies, can't wait to shoot you in the boogaloo," which is what they call their coming civil war. So it's sort of a thing where we try to reach out, and is there anything there to reach out to?
There are some. I had a kind of similar reaction. So I've definitely looked into the reaction to my podcast, It Could Happen Here, on the internet, and found a variety of different reactions to it. I found there's a great AK-47 focused forum on the internet where they really liked it, and they were all very conservative. And, the general attitude was, I like what he's saying. I think he has good points. I hope, as long as he's not bashing conservatives, I'll keep listening. And then the reaction to AR15.com was very much, look at this fucking idiot. Like, he's just trying to justify grabbing our guns, that sort of thing. So it's, when you talk about reaching out to the armed right in sort of solidarity of, hey, we both agree this is important, that's a hard thing. It's definitely not an easy goal to accomplish, and may in fact be impossible to do in a meaningful way. I don't think that means it's valueless. I think there are sane people, sane moderate gun owners who are conservative, who can be reached. And I think that in time, if things don't cross over into that abyss too quickly, one thing that could actually make us safer in the long run is that if what we've seen, the seeds in the SRA and, the Huey P. Newton gun club and the John Brown gun club, or whatever different groups it's broken into now, if what the armed left evolves into is a large armed leftist and some liberals contingent of the population, and that goes on for long enough that people on the center right realize, oh no, there are a lot of lefties who agree with me that this is important, that might actually, in the long run, it's not going to stop a civil war in the short run, but in the long run, it might reduce radicalization and also allow productive gun control. I'm not one of these people who says there's nothing to be done to prevent mass shootings. I think a ton of new laws could be enacted. I just don't agree on the banning of firearms. And I think if you had a sizable liberal and leftist contingent of people who were armed with the same weapons as the right saying, hey, we value this too. We're not trying to take your guns away. We have these guns as well, and we don't want to give them up. We just think more can be done to stop little kids from getting shot dead in elementary schools. And isn't that a good thing we could collaborate on? I don't think that's something that's feasible right now, because the political situation in this country is just so goddamn cuckoo banana pants. But I do think that in time, those conversations might be productively fostered, especially if liberals and leftists continue to arm in larger numbers and continue to not just arm because they're scared, but because it's fun to shoot. It's a fun hobby. It's a good thing to do. I think in the short run, you're probably going to continue to have the kind of interactions you've had, which are not super productive. But I think continuing to slog at building that kind of understanding and communication might eventually be something that reduces radicalization and makes us all a little bit safer.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the sort of deal of, if there's a civil war coming, when do you think it's coming? And if you think it's coming in 2020, then, well, reaching out to the right is probably a waste of time. But as pessimistic as I am, I still have some degree of hope and belief that it probably won't touch off anytime soon, not in the next couple years. My concern is for American society in the long run with the trends that we know are going to happen. So the report came out that said that we have 12 years to address climate change in order to prevent an excess of 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature. So that was a year ago. We're down to 11 years left to address this problem. And looking at whoever wins the next election or the election after that, I don't see a viable way for the US to address climate change, and I don't think the rest of the world is necessarily going to do so as well. So sort of the concern that I have that drives me to believe that the left should arm defensively is, what is the world going to look like after a 2 degrees Celsius or a 3 degrees Celsius rise in average temperature? What will this do to our society? And especially sort of tying together the conflicts in the Middle East with what's going on in America, when refugees from the Syrian civil war and from Libya and other countries in the Middle East and North Africa started fleeing to Europe in search of a more stable political climate and more developed economies, the reaction among the European people was a hard right turn towards fascism. Hungary, Poland, much of the Balkans, even Brexit in the UK, and with the close loss of Marine Le Pen in France, when there's a wave of immigrants fleeing some event in their home country, moving to a more developed economy, the reaction seems to be this turn towards fascism. And so my concern is what happens if climate change causes refugees to flee north towards the United States. What is going to be the consequence of that when we already have people calling for walls, calling for shooting border crossers, calling for all this violence and oppression against immigrants? What's that going to do to American society if this problem escalates in 10 or 15 or 20 years?
I mean, it could absolutely be an unspeakable nightmare. But I will say that that's not the only thing you've seen happen in Europe. Several countries have turned far to the right, and there has been a general resurgence in far-right activism across Western and parts of Eastern Europe as a result of all this. But that shouldn't discount what we've also seen happen among chunks of the European left. In Greece, I know a number of Greeks who have organized very large groups dedicated towards finding refugees who wind up on the shore, providing them with food and with what they need to get along on their journey. There's also been a lot of solidarity, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that as much, radicalization as we've seen grow in Germany as a result of the refugees taken in, we've also seen millions upon millions of Germans be very supportive of taking in 1 million refugees, which is a huge, huge thing to have done. So, and it's not known where things are going to tip out right now, because we've also seen Erdogan has seen increasing, in just the last year or two, increasing resistance to his party and to his politics. And so it's not just that the right is growing in these places unchecked. It's that things are getting more extreme in general. But the right's still the minority in most of these countries. Not all of them, because again, Hungary and Poland have taken hard far-right turns. But it's one of those things where it's still very much up in the air as to what's going to happen. And we shouldn't forget that if you were looking at the United States in the mid-30s, it would have been reasonable to say, well, they're trending far to the right and they're going to go fash just like Italy and just like Spain and just like Germany. And then we wound up bombing the ever-loving hell out of the fascists. And so it's not guaranteed that we will end up on the right side of the possible looming global war against authoritarianism or between authoritarianism and democracy. But it's also not guaranteed that we're going to continue on our far-right course. Now, it's one of those things when I analyze American history in the period leading up to World War II, there's a lot of great things to criticize FDR on, chief among them the internment of tens of thousands of Japanese Americans, which is a horrible crime. At the same time, if we didn't have a guy with that kind of charisma and that kind of ability to reach ordinary Americans, taking a strong stand against fascism, I don't know where our country would have ended up. We might have wound up with Lindbergh or someone taking the side of the Nazis. And it's definitely worth being concerned about that I don't see a single figure on the left in America right now with that ability to speak to people. And it may be that the partisanship of our news media, particularly TV news, has made it impossible for any single figure to reach across the aisle like that and communicate that effectively with that large chunk of the population. So in conclusion, yeah, I'm worried too. I'm not going to say all is lost in Europe or in the United States, and increasing numbers of climate refugees could cause an even further right shift in this country. But we've also seen huge numbers of Americans in just the last 2 years be increasingly confronted with the violent realities of climate change and have their lives upended by climate change. The Americans who have suffered the most from that are overwhelmingly Americans in the Midwest and the South. Since most Americans now do agree on the reality of climate change, especially with really cogent, intelligent political actors in the country preaching to these people, it's not impossible that they might wind up with more of a sense of solidarity to these climate refugees from south of the border. The shared suffering might, in fact, lead to drastic and more effective action against climate change being taken in the next couple of years. I'm not going to say that's a given, but it's certainly not impossible. And I think keeping a sense of hope about the future is important so that we don't all take a bunch of painkillers and just try to piece out of the situation. You need to have hope that it can get better. And these people who, a lot of whom voted for Trump in 2016 in the Midwest and the South, they're not committed fascists. They're not committed Nazis. Most of them are very politically uneducated. Most of them are not educated very well in the traditional sense, but they're not necessarily dumb people. And they're people who are suffering and who correctly understood that Hillary Clinton was not going to do a goddamn thing about their suffering and went with the guy who was talking to them. I think a lot of those people have now seen that he's not doing shit for them either, which is why you've seen polling numbers in places like Virginia start to shift back. I think a lot of the people who need to be reached for the U.S. to take large, effective stances towards climate change can be reached, and I think some of those people can be convinced that people who are fleeing here because climate change has rendered their home in Honduras under a mudslide or whatever, I think those people, they're not devoid of compassion. A lot of them are extremely compassionate people, and many of them are more likely to actually take direct action to help other people if they can be, reached and sort of de-radicalized from whatever Fox News has put in their heads. So I don't think we're doomed, and I think that people should be optimistic about the ability to reach their fellow Americans, because if we don't feel that way, then the only option left is to take guns into the streets.
Absolutely, and that's why the armed left should not be the primary organizing goal of left-wing politics right now, because having an armed left is sort of a backstop. It's your emergency in case things do go south, but the primary goal of left-wing organizing right now should be reaching out and trying to bring people into the fold of recognizing that we need to address these solutions. We need to address climate change. We need to address wealth inequality. We need to be compassionate towards immigrants and recognize the sort of capitalist competition that makes people develop hostility towards immigrants. And so I think that, yeah, it is really important to have hope and to have these sorts of positive left-wing politics as well. It's the sort of situation where people like Bernie Sanders, who recently went on a town hall on Fox News and managed to reach out to a lot of conservative people and speak to them from a very left-wing perspective, and I think got a fairly positive response. I don't think that people should judge the response from the right based solely on the crowd, because that is partially democratic, but I think a lot of people are receptive to Bernie's message, because that's sort of the core of why people are upset and scared and unhappy in our current political and economic climate, because the center right and the center left for so long have been telling them, no, everything is fine. You don't need to change the system. We just need to do a few tweaks here and there, subsidize IT education in West Virginia for coal miners, and then everything will be great. But that's not a real solution, and people know that it's bullshit. And so when you get a left-wing figure like Bernie Sanders talking to people and saying, actually, there are people responsible, and there is a system responsible for your suffering, and we can do real things to address that. And I think that's sort of the message that the left needs to carry forward. And I believe in a sort of diversity of tactics, and I believe that electoralism is important, as is more radical organizing and sort of, community defense groups doing sort of cooperative enterprises, forming unions. I think that we need to be pushing on all fronts to let people know that, hey, you have the power to help yourself and fight back against the system that is oppressing you, and that's the way that you should go, rather than demonizing your fellow man. I think that's the sort of organizing people should be focusing on, and then SRA and arming the left is the backstop.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends on the far left who are big theory heads, and I'm not going to say there's no value in reading theory, because theory is in a lot of cases history, and I wouldn't have a job if I didn't think there was a value in teaching people history. But I think it's less valuable to read your Marx and your Lenin and your Bakunin and your, whoever, and preach that to people than it is to do what Bernie did and get out in front of a bunch of people who are not primed to agree with you and talk about very direct solutions to their problems in a way that's not ideological. And there's a lot of very valid criticisms of Bernie Sanders and of the Sanders campaign. But I will always love him for one specific reason, which is that when my entire family went for Trump in 2016, my aunt, who is a lifetime Republican voter, who has always been very conservative, voted for Bernie in the primaries and said he seemed like the only honest man in the election. So I have Bernie Sanders to thank that I have exactly one family member of my older family members. A lot of the younger ones are, of course, much more liberal and leftist. One of the people who raised me voted a sane way in 2016, and it's because Bernie Sanders reached her. And I will never not be grateful for that. And I will never not be grateful to him for doing more than I think any single figure to rehabilitate the word socialism in American political discourse. I'm sure Bernie knows his theory very well, but he didn't do it by preaching theory. He did it by getting out to groups of Americans and engaging with them and talking about very discrete and practical solutions to the very real problems in their life in an immediate manner. And that's what's necessary right now, is getting out to people and talking about specific problems and not trying to change them from being conservatives and saying, you identify however you want. We need to tax billionaires a hell of a lot more because they're not paying their fair share. And we need to put these specific groups of billionaires who have harmed your community in prison and take all their stuff. That's why your mom died of a pill overdose, is like this family who has $14 billion that we can take and put towards rehabilitating these chunks of the country that have been hurt. That's the sort of thing I think is going to do more to lower the temperature in this country and de-radicalize people than anything else. I care a lot less about politically how you brand what you're doing than that you get out there and do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And theory should always be a guide. I feel like there's an issue on the left that people sort of worship theory and worship theorists. When you read theory, you shouldn't be taking this as the step-by-step, this is what should be done, because all political theory is written in a specific political context. You should always read theory in the mindset of how can I apply these ideas to our current political climate and to my current situation, and how can I use these ideas to go out into the world and try to make it a better place and try to advance left-wing political causes that I think are important. I've got Marx and Luxemburg and Emma Goldman up on my bookshelf, but I don't go around quoting these authors to people because it's really not productive. And I'd also agree that political labeling is also less useful, especially on the left. One of the big things that we've been trying to do is pushing for solidarity across political lines on the left. Just because someone's a Marxist and someone's an anarchist doesn't mean that you have a lot in common. And when you look at the actual political situation that exists today, Marxists and anarchists need to be doing the same things, and they are doing the same things, and they should be doing those things together without bickering and infighting and denouncing each other over whether or not they agree with the actions or words of someone who died 100 years ago. So I think that's something that's really important for left-wing organizing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can learn from the way the Kurds, particularly the Syrian Kurds, deal with theory. Which is, there's a lot of political theorists. Öcalan has written a number of books on political theory, but at the end of the day, what you're seeing in Rojava is it's not like a lot of people like to think of it as like this sort of idealized anarchist state or whatever, which it is not. There's definitely hierarchy, particularly in the military, but they've taken a lot of ideas from those kinds of thinkers and from a variety of different sort of leftist thinkers, and they put them into very practical use. And I think one of the things that you have when you're a people in that region of the world where you've been continually subjected to genocidal violence and you have been fighting in an armed way for the entirety of everyone who is in that community's life is just this sort of dogged pragmatism, which is why I'm not someone who will defend the Assad regime. And I'm very frustrated by people in the left who do. Bashar al-Assad is by far the worst person on the planet right now. But the YPG and the SDF have worked with him, and in some cases directly fought alongside Assad's troops, like in the siege of Aleppo. And I hate Bashar al-Assad, but at the same time, you look at why the Kurds are making these calls, and it's well, look, this is a life and death thing for us. They're willing to work with us right now. this is just the way it is, and we'll be bedfellows with who we have to be with to protect ourselves and our people and to ensure our continued autonomy. It's the same reason they've worked with the United States in these regions, because it's like, who else is going to protect us and provide us with air assets, which we don't have on our own? We need these AGTMs in order to take out Turkish tanks. We need these air assets in order to protect us from, Turkish air power. So we'll work with whoever. And that's like, it's one of those things. I know a lot of people in Iraqi Kurdistan, too, who self-describe as socialists and who self-describe as leftists and even communists, who nonetheless love George W. Bush. And it's not because they know a damn thing about the incredibly toxic politics that George W. Bush brought into the United States. It's because Saddam Hussein killed half of their family, and Bush wanted Saddam Hussein dead. And like that's the end of it for them. They don't give a shit about his politics. When someone's tried to wipe your family out, all you care about is that they're dead now. It's a kind of pragmatism that I admire in the Kurds and that I think is important to understand. At the same time, I hope we never have to be that pragmatic here, because the only way to become that pragmatic is if you've watched huge swaths of your people wiped out.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the sort of situation where you have to look at, global versus local context, where I know many Marxist-Leninists may feel that Assad should be supported because in a global context it's fighting imperialism. But when you're on the left, ultimately you have to react to the politics and the situations that surround you. And you have to judge your actions on the basis of, what you can do for the people that you can help and the people that you can affect, rather than, situations that are beyond an individual human scale. And that sort of applies to in the United States, where we maybe don't have to stoop to that level of pragmatism, but you do have to be aware that our actions have to take place within the context of what we can do. What can be done within the current context? What can we do to advance left-wing causes? And if that means voting, that means voting. If that means making a co-op or a union, that means doing that. If it means buying a gun to defend yourself and your family and the people that you care about, then that's something that you should do as well.
Yeah, I will say, and this is something that will perhaps be unpopular because I've listened to some revolutionary left radio, and I know those guys, particularly Brett, will disagree with me on this. When I talk about imperialism, I think I see the United States as an imperialist power, and I do not support our imperialism. But I think Russia is just as much of an imperialist power. And I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine talking to people. You can't not see Russia as an imperialist power when you've watched their mortars and howitzers hammer towns and talked to people whose lives have been completely upended by Russian imperialist aggression. And the older I get, the more outside of my own politics, which tend more towards anarchism than anything. If I'm going to label myself, democratic confederalism is the specific system I've seen pushed that I think makes the most sense in an immediate term, especially to deal with like a lot of the issues between rural and urban that we have in the United States. I think aspects of that system would be helpful. But the older I get, the more I identify generally as anti-authoritarian, and the more I support a broad international front against authoritarian regimes. And that includes authoritarianism in the United States from the Republican Party and from the right in general. That includes opposition of authoritarianism from Russia, opposition to Assad's authoritarian regime, opposition to the authoritarian regime of Muammar Gaddafi. I will not support. I understand that some groups that I may support will work alongside a dictator in a case like Syria because their situation is that dire. I do not support dictatorship, and I don't agree with the idea that like sometimes a dictator is better than the alternative, which may be more chaotic. I won't make that bargain in my own personal politics.
Yeah, and that's absolutely a valid position to hold. People can disagree with that. I think Brett will disagree with that, but I think that that's a perfectly reasonable conclusion to come to. And if people disagree with you, then I think that they should disagree with you and carry on, because at the end of the day, we're all on the same side of how do we avoid right-wing fascism in the United States and elsewhere. And right now, we all need to be doing the same things.
And I think we need to remember, I brought up at the start of my podcast, the Portland Max stabbings, Jeremy Christian verbally harassing and assaulting those two young Muslim women, and then several very brave local men coming to their defense and two of them being stabbed to death. And when I talk about a broad front against authoritarianism, one of the men who was stabbed to death defending those young Muslim women was a registered Republican and a conservative activist. And that shouldn't be forgotten either, that when it came time to confront a fascist in a life and death situation, one of the two people who paid with their lives for doing that was a Republican. We can reach these people, and even if we can't get them to agree with us on everything, we can get them, some of them at least, enough of them, to agree about the importance of fighting fascism. And I don't think that's a lost cause, and it shouldn't be taken as one.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're about out of time, so thank you very much for coming on. Would you like to plug your podcast or anything else that you're working on?
Yeah, I'd like to plug my podcast as It Could Happen Here. I also have another called Behind the Bastards. If you like this stuff, you might enjoy it. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, I really support the actions of a group called the Rural Organizing Project. Consider donating or volunteering to them. And I also think mutual aid disaster relief is a fantastic and important cause, and you should look into that if you want to be more active in something that provides concrete benefit to people.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, Robert. It was great to have you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for talking.
Solidarity.
Yeah, solidarity.